Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started then. So today's session is going to be really open-ended. So if you have any questions along the way, feel free to just unmute yourself and jump in with your question. Or if it's easier, you can just send it through the Zoom chat. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. In today's session, I'm going to be going through a spouse client file from start to finish. And it's going to give you a sense of sort of how to use eState Planner while going through a client file. So to start, we're going to add a client. You're going to go to this add button. And really when you're adding any clients, the key fields are going to be first name and last name. So I'm going to say this client's called Ben Collins. Middle name, you can put it in, but it's optional. In the email field, this is here if you want to send the client the online questionnaire. So you'd put in their email, and then you'd click this use questionnaire box. And when you went to add them to the system, you're going to have two options. So you can either send the questionnaire link directly from eState Planner, or you can copy a special link that you can send to the clients from your own email. And that way you can sort of customize the email a bit more that way. And whichever option you choose, the client's going to get that questionnaire link and they're going to click on it, and then they're going to have to create a password just so that their information stays secure and so that they don't have to do the whole thing in one sitting. They can come back into it. And then they go through and enter in their profile, family tree, asset, and debt information. So we have a question: how much data from the questionnaire can be automatically imported into eState Planner? So everything in the questionnaire, so there's going to be the profile information on the client, the family tree information about all the individuals that are added to the family tree, any asset information that's added, and debts as well. So all of that sort of important background information on your client, that's going to be inputted in from the questionnaire automatically. But it's not going to collect any planning information or appointments information, as that's meant to be done in the meeting with the client, since there's lots of things to be discussed there. So this is just more about information intake. But you don't have to send the client the questionnaire if you don't want to. Maybe you like to do all of that information intake in the actual meeting itself, or maybe you have your own sort of PDF or Word document that you like to use. So in that case, you just wouldn't worry about putting in their email and don't click the use questionnaire box, and then it's not going to send anything to the client. So we're going to go ahead and add Ben Collins in. And now, since today we're doing a spouse client file, this means we're doing wills for both spouses. Anytime you're doing that, you need to add them both as separate clients to the system and link them together using the spouse client function, as this is going to ensure that any joint asset or shared family tree information will automatically populate in both of their profiles, so you don't have to do it twice. And also, if it's more of a mirror will situation, it's going to allow you to sync the scenarios and the planning from one spouse to the other. So again, you don't have to do it twice. So we're going to add the spouse. We're going to add in Lauren Collins. And then this is the key field here, this spouse client function. So you're just going to click on it, and you're going to click the name of the other spouse. And so whenever you're using this, you need to add in the first spouse normally without touching this field, because when you're adding the second spouse, the first spouse will then be in the system, so their name will appear in this drop-down list. So you can only do the spouse client linking when you're adding the second spouse as a client to the system. And then we'll go ahead and add that in. Then you just decide who you're going to start with. So I'm going to pick Ben, click on his name, and it'll bring us into his profile. And here are the two icons. So if you haven't sent the client the questionnaire, or if you have, but they haven't filled it out yet, this is what you're going to start with. And usually what I like to do first is edit the client's information. And to do that, just double click right on the client's icon. And so really all the key information for anyone on the family tree is going to be first name, last name, and gender, just so that the wording of the will comes out properly. Also known as, for the client specifically, will populate in the will. It won't for anyone else, but it will for the client. Date of birth, let's say June 7th, 1960. And that age will automatically populate for you. Country of birth, citizenship, And all of this other information, this is good to have on your client, but it's not going to affect the generation of the will itself. Residency is important because however you set the province as here is how the system's going to know to calculate the probate tax on the assets tab, and also how the system's going to know which precedents to generate. So currently, we have precedents for Ontario, BC, Nova Scotia, and Alberta. So if you're from any other province other than Ontario, you're going to want to make sure to change this to make sure that your correct precedent is generating when you click those documents to generate. The city field, it's also important because it will populate in the will. It'll say Ben Collins of the City of Toronto. Special circumstances for the client. This is a place where you can note any potential capacity issue. So you would just mark it off and you could write a description in below just to make sure this is really well documented in case there'd be a will challenge down the line. And then relationships, it's just telling you who else is involved. So who is tied to the client on the family tree. So right now it's Lauren. This is a place where you can sort of fix relationships if maybe, for example, you added in a child that was actually a parent, they were coming up wrong on the family tree, but you didn't want to delete them. You can change their relationship over here. We have another question. Are there ways to make certain fields in the questionnaire mandatory? So not currently. So currently there are only a couple mandatory fields, and they're signified with a little asterisk, like first name and last name. But currently you can't really control what is mandatory yet, but that's good feedback. I'll definitely take that to the team. And we're going to just save. So anytime you're adding to the family tree, it works through direct relationships. So you have to click on the individual that you want to add to once to get the blue circle around their icon. And then you go up to the add button and then you select the relationship. So we're going to add a child to Ben. Whenever you're adding a child, you're also going to get this other prompt as to who the other parent is. If it's Lauren, the current spouse, if it's a new parent, so an ex-spouse that is going to be involved in the will, or a single parent. So they're either genuinely a single parent or there's an ex-spouse that isn't going to be involved, so you don't need to add them to the family tree. But let's just say it's Lauren. And then we'll enter in the child's information. So we're going to call them John Collins, male, date of birth, let's say June 10th, 2000. And then the special circumstances section for anyone that's not the client is a place where you can sort of note relationship difficulties or estrangement to the client. But really most importantly here is disability. So if the individual is disabled, you're going to want to make sure to check off this box here so that later on, if you're creating a fully discretionary trust to the death of the beneficiary for this individual, then it's going to draft a special Henson trust clause in the will. So you need to make sure you mark off that they're disabled here so that the system's able to pick up on that. Now, let's say you wanted to add in a grandchild. So you can't just add a grandchild directly to the client. What you have to do is add a child to the client, click on the child's icon, and add a child to that child. And that's how you get the grandchild's information in. So we're going to call her Lily Collins, and we'll just say female and add her in. Same kind of thing for nieces and nephews. You'd click on the client's icon. It would add a sibling to the client, click on the sibling's icon, and add a child to the sibling. And that's how you get nieces and nephews on the family tree. There's going to be anybody else involved in the will in a beneficiary or a trustee capacity, but they are not family. You can go over to this All tab, and it's going to list everyone you've added in, so all the family members, but it's also going to give you an opportunity to add in other people that aren't family or that are just so distantly related that you don't want to build out the whole family tree to get to them. So you just go up to this Add button, and then you enter in the individual's information. So I'm going to say that Jordy's going to be involved at some point later on in the will. Maybe he'll be a beneficiary. So we're going to add his information in. And then it's going to ask us about his relationship. So who is he related to? He's related to the client. What's the relationship? Let's say he's a friend. And then we'll add him in. So now he's going to be in our list and he's going to be in the system. So we've got all that information. And later on, when we're choosing beneficiaries or appointees, we'll be able to choose him from the drop-down list. So that's the people section. Does anyone have any questions so far? Nope. Okay, we'll keep going. So the next section is assets. And this is where you're going to list all of your client's assets. You're always going to start with the general personal effects, just to make sure that if you want, when you get to the scenario section and you're planning, if you drag the general personal effects and you create an initial gift, then it's going to generate a special disposition of personal effects clause in the will. So you're always going to start with that. You don't need to value it. You could just sort of leave it as is. It's more of a placeholder to remember, to remind you to gift it so that you're triggering that clause. For any other assets, you can add in all the client's assets with values, give them a nice sense of what their estate value is looking like at this point in time. But really, for the will generation purposes itself, the only assets that you need to add in this section are those that are going to be specific asset bequests or registered assets that you want to confirm or do new designations for. So let's add in a couple. You just go up to the add button, you pick your sort of category and type. Let's just say we're going to start with a bank account. For any asset that you're adding into the system, really the asset name field is the key field there. So you're going to want to change the asset name to however you want it referred to, if it's going to be a specific request in the will, or if it's not, just how it's going to be referred to throughout the system, so you make sure you're planning for the correct asset. Because if you're adding in multiple bank accounts and they're all called bank account or bank account copy, it's going to look weird and it's going to get confusing as to which is which. But if I know that this is the RBC bank account, whatever the account number is, and the other bank account that I'm adding in is going to be the CIBC bank account, and I can differentiate and make sure I'm planning for the correct asset. Let's just say the balance is $100,000. You don't have to put it in. You don't have to value or balance it, but it looks a lot nicer in the visual summaries when you generate those, because it gives you a sense of what's going where. The probate tax will also automatically calculate for you based on whatever you've set the client's residency as. So it's calculating based on Ontario law. Next, let's go for a house. So again, you can change that asset name if you want. Maybe they have multiple homes and this is the family home. The address field will populate if you are going to gift it as a specific bequest in the will, so you can fill that out. Firm value, let's say it's $1 million. Then you've got a mortgage / encumbrances field. So if there is a mortgage on the property, you're going to want to put the value of that mortgage in this field here. The next section is called debts, and you can add a mortgage in there, but if it's associated with a specific asset that you're adding into the system, best practice is to add it in this field here. Because not only is it good to know what asset the debt is associated with, but it's also going to have an effect on how much probate tax is calculated on that asset. The one thing is just make sure you're not adding it in both places. So don't put it in this field and add a separate debt on the debts tab, because it will double count it. So best practice is just put it in this field here and don't add it again on the debts tab. Ownership, you can change it, joint, tenants in common. Let's say it's joint. And then we'll add Lauren as the other joint owner, and we'll add that in. And since we've linked them together, if I switch over to Lauren's profile, I can see this family home is already in her list of assets. So I wouldn't have to go in and add it again for her when we're going through her profile. So let's just do one more. Let's go for an RSP. So again, I'm going to put that identifying information in. The beneficiary field, this is whoever the current beneficiary is on the policy. So later on, you're going to be able to decide whether you want to confirm or do a new designation and whether or not you want that included in the will. So we've got another question. What examples would a multiple will be useful? Could it be used for real estate property? So for multiple wills, you're going to want to use those anytime you want to avoid probate tax on certain assets, like if maybe you have some personal effects that are really highly valued, if you have private company shares. For real estate specifically, there's only really, if it's registry system real estate, then it could fall into the secondary will. But that's really the only case of real estate when a secondary will would come in useful. Current value, let's say it's 100,000. So you're going to notice that the probate tax always automatically calculates for you, but the income tax doesn't. And this is just due to the variability of different clients' tax brackets. So what we usually like to put in here is an estimate of the highest possible tax it could incur. So for something like an RSP, we put in like 50% of that. For an asset with a capital gain, we do like 25% of that gain. Just so you're showing sort of an estimate of the highest possible tax it could incur. And then we'll go ahead and add. So that's the asset section. Any questions here? Nope. Okay, so we'll move to debt. So this is really more for planning. It's not going to affect the generation of the will itself. We're not going to put in a mortgage because we don't want to double count it. But let's say there's a credit card debt, 5,000, and we'll add that in. Then scenarios. This is really where all the planning occurs. And the idea is that depending on your client situation, you're going to go through each scenario and create a plan so that you're covering your bases. So you start with surviving spouse. So what's the plan if the spouse is still alive when the client's passed away? Then you go to descendants only. So what's the plan if there's no spouse, no client, but there's kids or grandkids around? And then lastly, your no descendants, like your ultimate disaster. So everyone's gone, what's happening to the estate? And there's two ways you can go about doing this. You can go through it manually by clicking into a scenario and going through each section. So there's the joint designated asset section, which is where you're going to put any assets that are joint or designated to another individual to show that it's falling outside of the estate. Initial gifts is where you're going to create specific asset bequests or cash legacies. And then the balance of the estate, this is how you're dividing up the residue, either by adding a segment and gifts within the segment, or by running a macro if it's a more common residue breakdown and it matches one of the lists of pre-populated macros. So you can go through it this way, or if you're dealing with a more typical client situation, there's a faster way to do it, which is by using these E-plans, so this lightning bolt up in the top corner. So E-plans are basically like giant macros that go through each of the scenarios and the appointment sections for you and create a plan based on whichever one you choose. And the nice thing about it is, even if it's not the exact plan you want to create, if it matches most of the details or even some of the details, you can run it and then you go through each scenario and you can make any changes that you want. But the nice thing is that this way you're at least not starting from scratch, so it's going to save you some time. So I'm going to run this last E-plan. And now we're going to see what's happened. So we're still in that surviving spouse scenario. What it's done is it's given the RSP and the home to Lauren to show that they're falling outside of the estate because they're joint or designated. Initial gifts, it's given the general personal effects to Lauren because that's how you generate that special sort of disposition of personal effects clause to come up in the will. You gift the general personal effects in the initial gift section. And then the balance of the estate, you're going to click on the gray bar and click on it again. Lauren, absolute, 100%. There's no gift over because that second scenario, descendants only, is going to be our gift over. So we don't need to put anything here. So this is good. I don't need to change anything here. This is exactly what I would have wanted to do. So I can just move to the next scenario. I know joint designated assets. Initial gifts, it's got the general personal effects now going to the children if the spouse is away, is not alive. But let me show you how you would do it manually. So any specific asset bequests, all the assets that you added to the system are going to appear as these green boxes over here. And then you just drag and drop it over. There's people, classes, charity. I'm going to do the class of children. And then whenever you're doing a class or multiple people for the personal effects, you're going to get this new sort of distribution method section. So you can choose how you want the personal effects distributed in the system. So you don't need to make that choice in the document. I'm going to say trustee's discretion. And then the balance of the estate, we're just going to click on the gray bars. It's telling us children in trust, 100%, same trustees as executors. The duration when the beneficiary reaches age 30. I want to change this to 25 instead. Mandatory payments, I want to change this as well. So I want to set 21, they get 25%. Unlimited discretion, gift over, first to beneficiaries issue, then to other class members. And then I'll just save. And so now I've worked off the E-plan, but I've ultimately created the trust that I wanted to create with the details that my client wanted. And it saved a lot of time by not starting from scratch. And if Lauren's going to want the same descendants only scenario in her will, I can click this little spouse sync button. And what it's going to do is it's going to copy Ben's descendants only scenario over to Lauren's descendants only scenario. So it's going to copy the residue breakdown, anything that's joint between the two. The only thing it won't copy over are solely owned assets because it wouldn't be their asset to give away. Then we'll go to the last scenario, no descendants. So because we ran that E-plan, it's giving half to siblings and half to spousal siblings. But I can always just clear it, and I don't necessarily have to create a plan for this scenario. If maybe I have a really big family, I don't think it's ever going to get to this point, I don't necessarily have to do this one. But I'm going to do one. I'm going to say I want to give half to Jordy and half to Epilepsy Toronto, a charity. So I'm going to create 2 segments and gifts within the segment. So I'll start with segment 1 for 50%. So now I've created this 50% segment. I have to specify what's happening to this 50%. And I'm going to do that by adding a gift. I'll pick Jordy. Absolute, 100%. This means 100% of the 50% segment is going to Jordy. So I don't want to divide up the 50% segment even further. And then I'll put a gift over into beneficiaries issue. So now, with the looking at the circles, I could see that of this 50%, I've dealt with 100% of it. So I don't need to add any more gifts because I've already dealt with all of this 50%. What I need to do is deal with the other 50%, and I do that by going back to segments and adding my second segment for the other 50%. Now I'll add my gift. I'm going to do a charity this time. So you can just search right in the search bar and it will search the CRA database for you. And it's going to have all of their information and their postal code and registration number that's going to populate in the document. So now I've dealt with 100% of this 50% and therefore 100% of everything. And I can sync this over to Lauren if she wants the same for hers as well. So that's the scenarios section. Any questions here? Nope. Okay. So next is appointments. This is where you're going to appoint your estate trustees and your guardians if you need to do that. So because we ran the E-plan, it's already made Lauren, the spouse, the primary estate trustee. To add anyone else, you're just going to go to the add button. You can pick people or trust corporation. If you choose a trust corporation, their specific trust company clauses will populate in the document. I'm going to pick Jordy. And then the condition, this is really the key field as it determines whether they're a primary or an alternate. So if they're primary, you're going to select none, so no conditions. If they're an alternate, you're going to specify a condition. And usually I pick if all specified cannot act, and then I check the specified line to make sure that's correct. And then I'll add that in. I can do a further alternate. So I'll go add. I'm going to pick John. Same thing. I'm going to pick if all specified cannot act, but this time I'm going to change the specified to Lauren. So now it's going to, oh, actually, I'm going to change that back. I'm going to change it to Jordy.
Yes.
Now it's going to read Lauren if Lauren can't act, Jordy if Jordy can't act, John. So it just sort of depends on, you're just playing around with the condition, and that's what's going to determine whether they're primary, an alternate, or further alternate. And you can sync up in the top corner to the spouse. The last thing I'm going to go over today is provisions. Now there's a couple of things here. The first is funeral arrangements. So if you want those in the will, you can just type them on the line. Otherwise, just get rid of the text and there won't be a body disposition clause. Include future members. This is if you're using class gifts in the will and you want future members of that class to be used in the definition. So we use the class of children. So if I check this box, it's going to define children in the will as John Collins and any other child born to or adopted by me and Lauren. Class restrictions, same thing. You can restrict certain members of being part of a class. Trust for beneficiaries under a certain age. This is your general trust clause. That's going to guide underage beneficiaries that you haven't set up specific trusts for. You can keep it at 25 or you can change it to a different age. Then this is secondary will asset. So if you're doing multiple wills, primary and secondary, then here's where you can pick and choose which definitions you want included in the secondary will. So this will give you a sense for that question earlier about all the things that could potentially be covered in the secondary will. So technically you could check all these boxes and it'll include all of the definitions in case the client ever has any of these assets, it would be able to fall under the secondary will. So you just cover yourself that way. But if you're just doing a single will, you don't need to worry about checking or unchecking anything. It's not going to affect it. And up in the top corner in this little circle with the exclamation point, these are advisor insights. So it's like contextual alerts that's advising you to make sure you're more confident in your plan. They haven't missed anything important. Some of them will go away, like if I went back and put in a gender for Lauren, this would disappear. But some of them are always there, like request prior wills. So it's just a helpful resource to go through to make sure you can be more confident that you haven't missed anything. The next little function is notes. So you can make any notes on your client here. And these do populate at the end of the text summary. And then the last button is the download button. So this is where you're going to generate all your documents and your summaries. So there's 3 summaries that you can generate. The first is the profile. It's going to give you all the information on everything that the clients filled out in the questionnaire or that you filled out for them. So it's got all the profile details, all the information on the people and their family tree, all the assets and debts as well. So this can be a good resource to give to your client after the planning meeting so that they can check over and make sure that spelling of names and asset details are correct. The next one is the graphic scenario summary. So it gives you a nice visual representation of the will for each of the scenarios. And if you're putting in asset values, it's going to be a lot nicer because it's going to give you a sense of what's going where. And the last one is the text scenario summary. So it's got all the details on everything. So who you've appointed, how you've divided up everything, what gifts you've created. It's like the will without the legal use, essentially. So those are the summaries. Then you go to documents. These are all the different documents you can generate. Today we're going to do a single will. You can always change the signing date or take it out and put it in the will manually later. Registered asset designation. This is if you want to confirm or do new designations for the registered assets in the will. If you don't want them to be referred to at all, just uncheck this box. Joint designated asset confirmation is basically something that says anything that's joint is truly intended to be joint, not held on a resulting trust. Counterpart is if you're signing a counterpart. Simplified is a shorter will with less definitions and powers. The will guide is a nice chart at the end of the will that guides the client to the different clauses, and a cover page is just a cover page. And then you can pick witnesses and you can do your affidavits as well. And then you just click generate in the bottom corner, and it's going to give you a Word document that's fully editable, so you can make any changes that you want. I'll just go through it briefly. Funds and plans is if you check that registered asset box. Assets passing outside of the will is if you click that joint asset box. Here we've got our definitions. My children means John, and any other child born to, because we checked that future children box on the provisions tab. Then here we've got our appointments, Lauren, if not Lauren, Jordy, if not Jordy, John. There's our funeral arrangement. Here's the special disposition of personal effects clause that generates when you gift the general personal effects as an initial gift. Here's the residue. So it's going to Lauren, if not Lauren, the trust for the children. And then ultimately half to Jordy, half to Epilepsy Toronto. And if we scroll all the way to the bottom, we'll get to our nice little will guide that's going to guide to the different clauses in the will. That's how you'd go through it. One other thing I do want to point out is this little question mark button. So if you're ever stuck on anything, you can click on it and it'll bring you right to our help desk, which has got lots of articles on how to do different things. Also got courses, specifically the eState Planner certification course, which is a free self-paced course that's going to take you through and teach you how to use the program for will planning. So it'll take you through all the ins and outs of the program, and I recommend sort of signing up if you're wanting to get to know the program better. But that about wraps it up for today. Does anyone have any final questions before we go? Nope. Well, if you do come across anything later, don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to help. You can email me, you can email support, and someone will be happy to sort of jump on a Zoom and guide you through. But thanks again for joining me today, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.